Welcome back, Bob Rasooli. In today's video, we'll walk through one more API 1184 question and make sure every detail is crystal clear. During welding inside an open compressor station module, the inspector observes the crew preparing to transition from SMAW to FCAW for the fill and cap passes. The approved WPS for FCAW specifies a minimum preheat temperature of 150 degree Fahrenheit and requires environmental protection if ambient temperatures fall below 32 degree Fahrenheit. The ambient temperature inside the module is 6 degree Fahrenheit with visible drafts entering through the open structure. The contractor insists that as long as they apply preheat to 150 degree Fahrenheit, the ambient temperature does not matter. The welders are qualified for FCAW in the 6G position. However, the FCAW consumable certificates and gas documentation are inside the QC trailer, not at the work location. According to API 1184 A2.4 and the welding joining tables, what must the inspector verify before allowing the weld transition to proceed? A. Allow welding to begin since the welders hold valid qualifications and the contractor intends to apply the required preheat, making the ambient conditions irrelevant as long as the WPS required temperature is reached on the base metal. B. Permit welding to continue as long as the WPS is approved, even if consumable certificates and gas documentation are retrieved later, because welder qualifications and preheat requirements take precedence over documentation availability. C. Stop the welding transition until the inspector verifies that the minimum preheat of 150 degree Fahrenheit is applied and maintained, that environmental protection measures are in place because ambient conditions fall below the WPS environmental threshold, that wind control or shielding complies with the WPS and project requirements, and that all consumable and gas certifications are on-site and accessible before welding begins. D. Reject the procedure entirely because any ambient temperature below freezing invalidates the WPS, requiring requalification of the procedure and welder performance tests before welding can resume. Option A is incorrect because it assumes that meeting the minimum preheat temperature makes all other environmental conditions irrelevant. API 1184 A.2.4 and its corresponding welding and joining tables require the inspector to confirm not only that the WPS minimum preheat is applied, but also that the environmental limitations contained in that WPS are followed. In this scenario, the ambient temperature is far below the WPS environmental threshold of 32 degree Fahrenheit, and the WPS explicitly states that environmental protection measures are required below that temperature. The contractor's belief that preheat alone solves the problem does not align with the standard because cold drafts, low ambient temperatures, and lack of wind protection can cause rapid heat loss, hydrogen entrapment, and weld quality issues. API 1184 places responsibility on the inspector to ensure that environmental controls are in place, and option A ignores these mandatory conditions, making it incorrect. Option B is also incorrect because it allows welding to continue without ensuring that required consumable and gas documentation is present at the work location. API 1184 is explicit that the inspector must verify that all welding consumables, gases, and related materials are accompanied by their certifications and must confirm that these records are available and accessible before welding begins. Option B proposes retrieving the documentation later, which is not allowed under the standard. The inspector must verify these items before the arc is struck. In addition, option B repeats the flawed assumption that welder qualifications and an approved WPS alone are sufficient. PI 1184 requires verification of environmental compliance, documentation control, and equipment/process alignment before welding is permitted. Therefore, option B fails to meet the requirements. Option C is the correct answer because it fully reflects what API 1184 8.2.4 expects the inspector to do in this situation. The inspector must verify that the minimum preheat temperature listed in the WPS is actually applied and maintained. The inspector must also ensure that WPS environmental conditions are met, including wind shielding and protection measures, because the ambient temperature is well below the 32-degree Fahrenheit environmental threshold established in the procedure. The WPS requirements take precedence, and the inspector cannot permit welding unless those conditions are met. Option C also correctly states that consumable certifications and gas documentation must be present and accessible at the work location before welding begins. API 1184 emphasizes documentation control, consumable verification, and alignment with the approved WPS and project specifications. Option C is the only option that fully captures the inspector's responsibilities regarding environmental controls, preheat application, documentation availability, and compliance with the WPS. Option D is incorrect because it misinterprets both API 1184 and welding procedure logic. While welding cannot proceed unless environmental conditions meet WPS requirements, a temperature below freezing does not automatically invalidate the WPS or require complete requalification of welders and procedures. The correct action is not to reject the procedure or mandate new qualification tests, but rather to enforce the environmental controls and requirements contained in the existing WPS. If those controls cannot be met, welding is simply delayed until they are. Option D overreacts and goes far beyond what the standard requires, making it an incorrect interpretation of the inspector's authority and the intent of API 1184.